And welcome to the CNBC Africa Exchange here at the Cullinan Hotel alongside the World Economic Forum on Africa 2019. It's great to be here in Cape Town, and we are talking about a topic that has become more and more in vogue: single-use plastics and the final straw. When will it all end? And when will this convenience become a thing of the past? And how is it evolving? Well, I've got a panel of experts with me who will unpack this particular conversation with me. So I'm going to kick off from my left here. I've got Jacques Vermeulen, CEO of the Coca-Cola Beverages Association. Thank you for joining us. Then next to him, we've got Professor Peter Ryan, Director of the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town. And then we've got David Lepage, Climate Leader at the African Climate Reality Project. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me this morning on a topic that I think is both very important, but very trendy as well. And I know that recycling was a big thing of the 90s and 2000s, but single-use plastic and the dreaded straw has become the latest fad. I would hesitantly say to be banned. Jacques, what's been your take on this latest trend in people becoming so conscious about single-use plastics?
Yeah. Just one correction: I'm from Coca-Cola Beverages Africa, not from the Beverage Association.
Oh, right, okay.
Apologies. Look, I mean, plastic plays an important role in a safe and hygienic distribution of food and the consumption of food and beverages across the globe. But the reality is the world has got a problem with plastic. Like so many other companies that produces food or beverages that people love, we've recognized that we contribute to that plastic problem of the world. But we're doing something about it. We're taking responsibility and we're investing behind it specifically to address the plastic waste in the environment. In 2018, the Coca-Cola company announced a theme and initiative around the world without waste. And what it in essence means that for every bottle or can, to collect a bottle or can for everyone we sell by 2030, which is 100% collection and recycle for whatever we put into the environment. So quite an ambitious and a bold initiative. On top of that, we also said that by 2025, to have an environment or a world where every plastic bottle we produce is coming out of recycled material that we put into the market, but 50% of the ingredients of the bottle is made out of recycled content. Very few people actually know that in South Africa, which is probably by far the best in the world, or from the world benchmark perspective, we're already collecting 64% as an industry of the plastic we're putting into the market, the plastic bottles. Our business, specifically in South Africa, we collect 114% of the plastic we're putting into the market, which is quite a significant benchmark against the global standards, with European standards as well as the American standards. So how do we do that? In 2004, as an industry, we created a company called Petco. And Petco's sole responsibility is the collection and recycling of plastic bottles. And it's been put together by the whole industry. So it's converters, brand owners, retailers, us as beverage producers, consumers, NGOs are playing a role, and the whole communities and where we operate is playing a role around that as well. And that is industry-led, industry-fund, and industry-driven to ensure we can keep the environment clean. The model has been hugely successful for us from 2004. To give you an idea, by the end of 2018, we've collected almost 99,000 tons of plastic bottles out of the environment in South Africa. That's equivalent to 2.3 bottles of plastic. And this model has been hugely successful to the extent that we're rolling it out into markets outside of South Africa as well, so Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And we've had huge success in terms of the collection and the ability. So I think Petco is a model that is a success story, but a success story of how to scale and cleaning and collecting and recycling the products that you're picking up in the market.
But Jacques, we could be doing more as citizens. I'm sure there's lots of room for improvement in terms of not necessarily having that much trash out in the world.
You can always do more.
Yeah.
We're already collecting 114%, as I said, of what we're putting into the market. But you're absolutely right. I think as an industry, as a beverage provider, as plastic providers, we can do far more. I think one thing that we need to think about is how do we standardize the plastic so that all plastic becomes recyclable? Because plastic's not the enemy. That's how we behave with plastic that becomes the enemy. And if we can get the collections being so simple that whatever you pick up, we can bring back into the environment for multiple uses, not a single use, but multiple uses. That's incredible value that we can contribute to the environment and society in general.
Professor Peter Ryan, you were saying just before we got started here, you were out collecting some trash this morning. There's a bit of a fascination with removing the straw out of the system, but really the straw is not as dramatic as some other things that are making their way into our oceans and into our environment. What are some of the things that you picked up this morning?
We were actually doing a litter audit at the University of Cape Town, which is not a very green institution. We just had a director of sustainability appointed, and so we're doing some baseline surveys for him. So most of what we actually pick up is cigarette stompies. I mean, literally, it's insane how many there are. But I think, I could talk about bottles a lot. I've been doing a lot of bottle work in the last year or so. But I think we need to step back from the problem and kind of just say, yes, plastics are a problem, but you can't just look at plastics in isolation. And banning is one potential tool. There's a whole suite of tools that need to be looked at in terms of managing the plastic problem. But there's an analogy going around at the moment that says, you come home and you find the floor is covered in water, and your tap is broken and it's gushing water. And one option is, you run out and you grab a mop and you start mopping the floor. Whereas what you should be doing is turning off the tap. And that's the sort of approach that the banning people are taking. But plastics are just one symptom of a much larger societal problem that we face in terms of our overconsumption on the planet. And if we focus too exclusively on plastics, there's a concern that we're actually not really dealing with the root cause of the problem, which is too many people and too much use of resources. I mean, we're beyond the planetary boundaries, and plastics are not one of the major threats to sustainability of life on the planet. So plastics are a nice thing if it gets people into other environmental concerns, but if you become solely focused on plastics and don't really tackle the underlying problems, then we're not going to get anywhere.
David, speaking to a much bigger issue, actually, it's not just plastic, it's actually a much bigger environmental issue. That's the space that you play in. Are you in agreement, or is there maybe still some space for some disagreement in that statement?
I'd agree with a great deal of what Jacques has just said. I mean, plastics are, if we talk about plastics, but plastics, 99% of plastics are made from fossil fuels being oil, gas, and coal. So when you're talking about plastics, you're actually talking about the fossil fuel industry, which of course is also the cause of 80 to 90% of the climate change that we're experiencing, and an industry which also is incredibly irresponsible and destructive in multiple dimensions: air pollution, inequality, corruption. So when we talk about turning off the tap of plastics, we need to talk about turning off the tap of fossil fuels, that is fueling climate breakdown and fueling plastic pollution. And the contribution of greenhouse gases from plastic production is actually quite shocking. I have done some research in the last couple of days in preparation, and I was actually surprised at the enormous contribution. That some estimates that we produce about 1.8 billion tons in emissions from plastics production each year. Put that in context of around 10 billion tons of global carbon dioxide emissions that are produced each year. So it's an enormous contribution. It's been fueled in the last few years, particularly by the shale gas boom in the United States, where there is around $190 billion worth of plastics infrastructure waiting to come online, waiting to contribute further to this problem. And to take it back a step and to connect it to some of the problems that we've seen happening in this country over the past couple of days. We've seen people absolutely appalled by gender violence in South Africa. We've seen people absolutely appalled by xenophobia and by xenophobic outbreaks. These are all the issues that are profoundly connected. Xenophobia is directed at people who are often climate migrants coming from other parts of Africa. Gender-based violence is a symptom of an extractivist economy that we've had in South Africa, where for too long, by far, we've been relying on a mining approach to our economy, where we take value from the environment and we take value from people, and we don't give nearly enough back. And we've now passed the fundamental boundaries, the environmental boundaries that Jacques was referring to. And so this extractivist economic paradigm that we've been living with for so long is 40 years past its sell-by date. And we now need to have a fundamentally different kind of economy, an economy which is restorative, which seeks to create and build and maintain ecosystems rather than mining them, as we've been doing for so long.
Well, I mean, when you start putting it into bigger scales, obviously it seems like a mammoth task, and somebody who's getting a plastic fork at their next takeaway might say, well, that is one hell of a thing for me to take on. Maybe I should just walk away from this and just I don't know.
There's one very simple way that we can start to look at this. Jacques mentioned that the University of Cape Town is not a particularly green institution. My work, I'm a climate leader through the African Climate Reality Project, but I'm also the coordinator of an organization called Fossil Free South Africa. We advocate for divestment from fossil fuel companies like Sasol, Exxaro, Billiton, etc. Our campaign started with trying to persuade the University of Cape Town, which is supposedly a center of excellence in climate change research, to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. And pretty much any middle-class person in this room has a pension fund or a retirement fund which is invested in these companies. So let's do the beach cleanups. Those are important. Let's cut back on our individual consumption. But let's also look at the system and where the system is getting its capital and what we can do to change where that capital is getting into the system. Change our retirement funds, change our investments. There's no space on this planet for irresponsible investment anymore.
Talking about kind of tackling the problem from the from the start, Jacques, are there any chances of us ever going back to the days of Coca-Cola in a glass bottle, where it all started?
That's a very good question. We are redesigning our packaging, so we're lightweighting it from a plastic perspective, and we're using more recycled material as well. We're also investing in returnable plastic bottles, so it's got a multiple use. But yes, we are investing more extensively in glass bottles as well, so the smaller as well as the big bottle. So it becomes a more refillable option and a much cleaner option for the consumer in the market. Yeah.
Talking about the business side of this and trying to, I guess, incentivize some sort of positive impact in terms of getting people to really recycle rather than completely discard. What is the economics of the plastic recycling space? I mean, for those who live in Johannesburg, we're all very familiar with this army of men who roam the streets, collecting paper, collecting plastic, collecting tin, moving it from one side of Johannesburg to another, and they get a per kilo rate. Yeah. What does that look like in terms of the economics of that?
Yeah, obviously the quality of what you pick up determines what you get eventually for it. So anything from 350 to 4 rand a kilo for what the people are picking up. But the interesting about that is that last year we given 68,000 people access to employment, which wouldn't have had access to employment. And it gives people a means to an end, and it helps the broader society as well. So it's definitely an ability and an option to give people something to work for, and it gives a means to an end for the society at large.
But it's really a habitual task. I'm going to throw this out to everyone here. I remember, I think 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited by one of the associations to a dinner, and they were making people aware of how much the restaurant industry doesn't recycle or isn't very conscious of how much they use and how much they discard and actually recycle. And they encourage us to get a bin and start recycling one item in the household. And I looked at my wife and I thought, okay, well, this is going to be an exercise and a half. I do come from a German family, so it's something that Germany's been doing for many years, sort of separating its trash, and here we were starting the story. And we got this dustbin, and every single evening after supper, we were looking for that one item that we were going to start recycling. Well, 3 or 4 years down the line, I think we've got 5 bins now. It's become a bit of a game of glass, paper, tin, whatever, and it's just become part of our routine. Professor, are we doing enough to really get people educated and encouraging people to really start separating at the point of use?
If you're talking within South Africa, I think the biggest problem we face is at the municipal level, and there's not enough systems in place to actually promote sort at source. That's the way to make recycling effective. If it has to go somewhere to a mixed waste sorting depot, you invariably get contamination, and it reduces the quality of the product. So if you can sort at source, I mean, we have this crazy situation in Cape Town where we're building another Table Mountain out on the Cape Flats because, we've run out of landfill space and they can't decide where they're going to put the next landfill. But we still continue to throw all of our mixed waste into a bin, which then some people pick through a few things. But if you actually do what you do and you put all your organics, which make up the bulk of the mass, and you compost that and you recycle what can be recycled, you end up with a very small amount of waste going to landfill. And as sorted source, if that becomes mainstreamed, pretty much everything can be used. There is no waste. It's just a matter of scale. If you have enough material, you can do something with it. It's just getting it to the right place effectively.
David, are we seeing any countries sort of further up into Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, are there any real champions and thought leaders in the space of being conscious of packaging and the use of plastic and the disposal of plastic?
Rwanda and Kenya in particular have long had plastic bag bans and are working to expand those bans onto other classes and categories of plastics, and the penalties in some instances for bringing in or importing plastics in those countries are quite stiff and quite a substantial deterrent, and it's made a very substantial difference to the landscape, as I understand it, in many places. And here in South Africa, if you go to I remember going through parts of the Eastern Cape a few years ago, seeing trees that are literally festooned in wind-blown plastic. And that plastic sort of breaks down, it gets caught up and runs into rivers, it gets eaten by animals in some instances, it runs into the ocean, it breaks down and fragments in the ocean. It's already part of the geology in some instances. There's a whole new, the plastic will be, I saw somebody the other day saying that if we look at what the consequences of this era in the fossil record, there will be plastic and chicken bones as two sort of major legacies of this time. But that plastic, when it's out there in the ecosystems and it's sort of starting to work its way back into food chains and contaminating the food that we want to eat, is also still, when it's, say, floating on the surface of the ocean, continuing to release carbon dioxide, continuing to contribute to global pollution and emissions.
Professor Peter Ryan, I see you some nodding there on those points.
Well, yeah, I actually just spent 3 weeks in Kenya doing some beach litter work, and you can see the benefits of the bag ban, but they have an enormous problem with bottles and solid waste in general. They have a basically dysfunctional solid waste system in the country. So the only solid waste management is by private contractors, effectively. And most plastic just gets burnt in the streets, which is a really bad idea from a health perspective. But I think, again, we have to step back from the problem and say, plastics are not the problem, people are the problem. If we can change people's behavior to plastics, there are many applications, even single-use applications, where plastics are the best option from an environmental perspective, because the cost of switching to a heavier material in terms of carbon emissions, the reduced shelf life of food potentially, if it's not packaged in a good barrier product like plastic, has very significant biodiversity implications. So you have to look at the broader picture, and this knee-jerk response of saying we must just ban all single-use plastics, I don't think is a very constructive approach. And it depends on the situation you're in. And if you're in a country where you have absolutely no solid waste management, then maybe that is the best strategy. But if you're in a country with a sophisticated solid waste management system, then in many applications, plastics are good. Things like straws, I would say absolutely, earbud sticks. There's a whole suite of things that are very conspicuous in the litter stream that seemingly we're struggling to actually get people to change their behavior on. In those cases, sure, let's ban them. But to absolutely go plastic-free in a single-use environment is counterproductive.
So in some cases, a bit of a necessary evil, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think it's an evil. I mean, people who want to go plastic-free entirely, you're going to give up your cell phone, your computer, your car, your airplane. Everything's got plastic in these days. You can't get away from plastic.
Yeah.
I'd like to take issue slightly with some of the things that Jacques has been saying. I think it's very counterproductive to say that people are the problem, because people are potentially also the solution. And
you mean Peter?
Peter.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
My apologies.
It's okay. Jacques gets blamed for everything.
We're used to that.
People are the problem because of the systems in which we're embedded. And we have to change those systems. And once we start changing those systems, and once we start participating in those systems in creative ways rather than constructive ways, then we can be part of much bigger solutions. If we start to look at the impacts that are created by particular classes of people, if we look at global emissions from fossil fuels, for example, around 80% of those emissions come from the richest 20% of the population. So if we want to talk about having fewer people on the planet, we should start by saying we want fewer rich people, because rich people are overwhelmingly responsible for the sort of waste production and the energy consumption that becomes such enormous problems. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, poor people are often living in communities where they have next to no waste management systems, where they struggle, where they are sold products in a multitude of tiny packaging because they can't afford to buy it in larger quantities, and they are not afforded the opportunity to get rid of that waste. So the systems are the problems. That we need to look at changing the systems and creating ways that people can participate in those systems in a far more creative and healthy way.
But there seems to have to be a big sort of global tipping point at the moment where we're seeing Canada making some dramatic moves in terms of banning single-use plastics to quite a large extent. Europe moving into a space
possibly to make up for their emissions from their gas use, oil extraction.
I suppose the starting point somewhere, right? But it seems like we are moving into hopefully a world that is going to be a little bit more discretionary in terms of the way we used to, like you said. I mean, at one point, I think I was buying croissants in a bag, and each croissant was packaged in its own little bag, and then that was sort of packed into a family
bag.
Yeah,
I think Woolies are still selling them.
And I think we're becoming a bit more conscious of that. On a global perspective, in terms of the beverage space, what are you seeing happening, in your particular sector?
Look, I mean, definitely there's a significant drive because I think consumers today are far more aware of environmental impact as well as the social impact. So as companies providing a beverage or a food, we're becoming far more accountable and responsible to be part of the solution rather than the problem. And I think one of the problems, if you take it back to in South Africa, is one of the key problems is that we have a lack of infrastructure to cope with the consumption of food and beverages. And we almost need to Peter's point, we need to start at the source and create that ability to be able to collect and recycle quite faster, because that will help us to keep the environment clean, but also put it back into a reproduction, and in so doing we'll add significant value, because plastic is incredibly valuable if we can just reuse it continuously for the various products it can do. And if we do that, it creates an incredibly clean environment, and everyone will be very happy and satisfied.
Professor, is it a matter of being too little too late, or are we about in time to try and still turn the tide on the trash wave that might hit us sooner rather than later? Again,
I don't think plastics is a particularly severe problem compared to the other problems we face. So, climate change is going to destroy our life as we see it. Whereas plastics, we could continue doing what we're doing, and it's mostly a nuisance and an aesthetic problem. I've studied the ecological impacts for 30 years, and they're modest. So it's oversold, in my opinion, at the moment, and we really should be focusing on worrying about what the climate's. The trouble is, people can't engage with climate change as an issue. There's that inherent lag, but we're committing ourselves to a situation that's going to really change the way we live on this planet, and that's scary.
And is that maybe possibly because it's something like you're saying? It's something that I can't tangibly touch or do. It's like I can't leave the house today and change the climate. But I can say no to my local, favorite coffee shop not to give me a swivel stick.
Yeah, I think it's a twofold problem. It's partly it's easier to tackle the plastic problem. It's very easy to say I won't take a straw, but it's harder to.